So I'm going to set up Windows 10 to enable SSH to a remote Linux instance. So the first thing I do, start Visual Studio Code, get a new embedded terminal going, and what we're going to do is log in to a remote Linux. This is a virtual machine, but it could be a VM in the cloud or a physical computer. So it would help if I type the right username in. Okay, so this is a Fedora instance. The first thing I'll do is create a user on the Linux box. So now on Fedora, typing user add TGN just creates the user, and as you can see, that user's there. But on Ubuntu, you would have to pass the user add command with the -m to say I want to create the home directory as well, otherwise you'd end up without having the skeleton of the home directory there. So now we've done that, let's change to the user that we've just created and set up the remote Linux installation to enable SSH. So I create a .ssh directory, change it so that if you have a look at the permissions there, you can see that only the user has read, write and execute permissions on that folder. And then what we do, we create a file named authorized keys and make it only writable by the current user. Now that file contains the public key, so that the remote Linux computer, it's got the public key, and then when the calling computer that wants to connect to it passes through the private key or something that's derived from the private key, and then the remote computer uses that to see whether it's valid and then allows the connection. So that's as far as we need to go so far. We then open the authorized key file to edit it, but we've got nothing to put in there at the moment. So now we're going into Windows, and we have a look here, and at the moment within the Windows computer, all we have is in the user's home directory. So the home directory is whatever excuse me, the home directory is whatever is under, I suppose, let's have a look, set that user profile, so that it's whatever's under the user profile there. Yeah, so yeah, the home directory will have a, as you can see, a .ssh folder, and that's where all your configuration for SSH is contained. So what we're going to do is we're going to use SSH Key Gen, and if you have a look at the top of SSH Key Gen, the type of key I'm wanting to create today is one of the newer style keys. They're a lot smaller and apparently they're more secure. So I'm going to create one of these ED25519 keys. So to do that, I've changed into the SSH folder. Then I go SSH Key Gen. The file I want to create, I'm just going to make it the same as the user. So JA is my user. And then I'm going to say the type is ED25519, and the empty ask for passphrase. Wouldn't recommend not putting a passphrase because then it's unsecured. So enter a passphrase, you'll get that image. Now, what do these keys look like? They're a bit different from the normal RSA key, the default ones. So that's a smaller key, but there's your private key and your public key there. Now the public key, what you then do on your Windows box, you just select it all, and I just right mouse button to pop that into the clipboard. Then I go back to my remote Linux instance, and this is Vim that I use, so just paste that in, and then colon WQ to write and quit. Now you can do that on many Linux instances. The default is nano, so you can also make that edit with nano as well. So there's another option. So I'm just going to go Control X to exit, and I want to say no to don't modify it. So all I've got in that file is that public key. Now let's test that from our PowerShell. So I know the user is TGN. I know the IP is 10.18.18. I think it's 21. Now, if I don't specify a private key, it prompts for password authentication. But at the moment, I'm going to need to go back to my user on the Linux, go to a user with permissions and set a password. Right, let's go back and try it again with the correct password. Right, so once you've set your password, you can then log in using password authentication. But what we're looking at the moment is how do we log in with that private key that we've copied into the authorized keys file on the remote Linux computer. We do it by just specifying that we want to use the key that we've created, the private key, which is the one without the .pub extension, and we specify that on the command line, and then we type in the passphrase, and as you can see, we're now logged into the remote Fedora instance. So from that point on, we've got the key nicely configured there. But let's now open up our SSH folder using Visual Studio Code and make it a bit more seamless. So we've opened up the folder. Now we're going to create a file named config. Now, if you create a file within VS Code and then you look down the bottom right hand corner, you'll see that the language is currently being detected as plain text. Now that's because VS Code does not recognize a config file as being an SSH configuration file. So what we can do is we can click on the extensions button, type in SSH, and then one of the top results will be this remote SSH editing extension. So click install and then go back to your config file. Now I can look down the very bottom right hand corner and see that it now says SSH config. And now if I type in host, which is one of the SSH commands, notice we've got auto completion. And now here, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to specify that when use SSH on this Windows machine, I want to say that whenever you connect to any host, attempt to authenticate using the identity file that I'm going to specify here. Now, what the squiggly line means, that just what the squiggly line equals is C users, so the path to my home directory, and then I'm using Linux sort of forward slashes, and I say my home directory /.ssh folder and use the JA command. Now the next thing we're going to do, I'll just call that host, or let's just call it remote, and then we want it to say, okay, that the remote alias resolves to this host name. And the specific user, I need to say, okay, the remote host and the user is TGN user. Now I could change it to, okay, I'll call it my dev or my Linux box. I could add aliases here, and that would just allow you to connect to whatever name is really easy for you to think about. Now, once we've configured this, let's have a look at what happens when we, let's say we use the Linux alias in the, so it asks for the passphrase and then it goes there. We could go back and let's choose the dev. And again, it asks for the passphrase. But you can see there that no matter what we enter that's in this configuration file, it will resolve it to the correct details, pass the private key to you to be unlocked, and then do the authentication. There is an issue here. This is annoying, having to continually add the passphrase. So on Windows, open your services app. So it's services. If you want the full thing, it's the services Microsoft Control Panel. So services MSC is the file name that you'd be launching. But yes, what we're going to do is look for, I usually just click in this column and then hit O to get to the O's, and then what I'm going to show you here, this is not running by default. You need to start this. So what you do, you right mouse button on this Open SSH Authentication Agent, you change it from being, what it will be is disabled, change it to automatic, and then just click apply and go OK. Maybe right mouse button and then hit start, and then it will start running. You then watch for the status to be running. So you need to get the Open SSH authentication agent running. Then in VS Code, start a new terminal, and it'll be in the PowerShell. But what you can do is go SSH add, and at the moment I've got an old key, so I'm just going to say, alright, so what I want to do, if I wanted to clear out what's being stored by the agent, I'd go SSHD, and then now what I want to do is go SSH, I want to add, and then looking at the options here, it says to use this, you just go SSH add and the file that you want to add as the identity. So to do that, you could be in another directory and type of a fuller path, but I'm already in SSH directory here, so I just say, okay, SSH add, and to add my private key. So once I do that, I simply then enter the passphrase, and then notice when I go SSH add and do the list command to show the identities, notice how the private key fingerprint is listed here, and we can see we made a ED 25519 key, so it's all specified there, and that key, which is equates to this particular key in our config file, is now loaded in memory, ready to be used to connect to the remote host. So once that's done, all you need to do, let's say SSH remote, notice how this SSH authentication agent then stores that, and then SSH will say, hey, have you got that key? So you don't need to enter a passphrase every time. It becomes a lot more seamless. Alright, so now we have our SSH on Windows configured. We've got the public key on the Linux host ready to check against, so that it can log into the Linux remote computer. Now what we'd like to do is get that remote SSH working through VS Code. So here we choose the remote SSH extension, so we go back into extensions, and then just enter SSH, and then choose this remote SSH from Microsoft extension, and use install. Now as soon as we install that extension, on our left hand navigation pane here, we see a new icon appear called the Remote Explorer. When you click on that, what you will notice, which is obvious when you first click on it, is that the SSH targets look through your config file in your user ssh.ssh directory, and then populate your file here, the list here, with whatever it finds. So you can then choose to say, okay, I want to connect to this host, and then you hit the button, the connect to host in a new window button, and then it will say, right, I want to connect. You've got to specify what type of host it is. In this case, it's a Linux host. Notice it also installs a component so that there's good two-way communication, a lot of good features available within VS Code through the SSH connector. So now that we're connected, you can see we're connected because we've got SSH and the name of the connection at the bottom left. We want to click the Open Folder button, and notice here I haven't got a development folder configured, so I can just cancel for a moment, just press Escape, go to my terminal, and just say I'm going to create a dev folder, and then I'm going to go File, Open Folder, and I'll choose to open the remote folder. Now that's not as interesting as if we had, say, let's say for instance we had a, I'll just get Chrome, Google Chrome, and I'll go cake PHP 4 installation, and we could then just grab our install command and get our terminal going, and let's say okay, so now at the moment this is where you would find that you would need to, before we do that, we'll just open that, and I think I'm going to make a problem here if I don't press the yes to get the last of the, but then you would obviously want to work from the root of your framework, and that is you are able to connect by SSH to the remote instance. Now, what you'll find with VS Code is you'll get in the background you'll get a few different instances, and you can close those other instances. When you close VS Code and then reopen it, what it typically does, it does where you were developing from last. So it will automatically, because you've in your VS Code and on your Windows instance, you've configured it to basically you've configured it to connect to that remote host automatically with the SSH key. You will not be prompted for all those authentication details. If you don't do that, if you rely on password authentication, if you don't have the SSH agent running, you'll always get to the point where you'll be prompted for the password, or it'll just become sort of another thing you do that you don't need to. So setting up the automatic authentication is a good idea.